Samuel Clarke was an English philosopher and Anglican cleric in the early 18th century. He lived from 1675 to 1729. He's not as famous as Anselm or Descartes or Kant, but there is at least one contribution that he made to philosophy whose importance, I think, can't be overstated, and that is his version of the cosmological argument. In this first video on Samuel Clarke's version of the cosmological argument, I'm going to lay out a couple of important definitions and talk through the first part of the cosmological argument. We'll try to put it all together in the next video. So, a couple of definitions that we'll need to understand in order for this argument to make sense. I don't think that these definitions are particularly difficult. They're simply important. The first one, a dependent being. Well, a dependent being is any being whose existence is accounted for by the causal activity of another being or beings. So I am a dependent being. I exist because sometime in the early spring or, in the early spring of 1971, my parents bumped into one another in the night. That's as much as I'm willing to think about that. But anyway, you are also dependent beings. You exist, whether you want to think about it in those details or not. You exist for similar reasons. You were brought into existence through the causal activity of other beings. How about an independent or self-existent being? Well, this would be a being whose existence is accounted for by their own nature, by its own nature. Now remember, we discussed when we were talking about the ontological argument that just because we're defining a term does not mean that that thing exists or even that that thing is possible, right? When we defined God, it does not follow that God exists or that God is possible. That's why in premise 1 of the ontological argument, we defined what God was, and premise 2 said God is a possible being. That thing that I defined in premise 1, that is logically possible. So I could define a Ralph as a round square. That's fine. Doesn't mean that a round square exists or even is logically possible. So this is fine. We don't know that there are independent or self-existent beings. We are just defining what that would mean. So we have definitions for a dependent being, that is a being whose existence is accounted for by the causal activity of another being or beings. So another being or beings brought this into existence. That's a dependent being. An independent or self-existent being is one whose existence is accounted for somehow by its own nature. All right. Now let's talk about part 1 of Clarke's cosmological argument. I'm going to call this the principle of sufficient reason. And I will sometimes even abbreviate this as PSR. So PSR, or the principle of sufficient reason, goes like this. There must be an explanation. A, of the existence of any being or thing, and B, of any positive fact. Well, we're going to talk in more detail about the principle of sufficient reason, but let me explain a little bit right now, and let's say what we mean by a positive fact. So, all we mean by a positive fact is anything that we state positively about the world. We don't have to explain something like why unicorns don't exist. That would be a negative fact. Nobody's saying that we have to have an explanation for why unicorns don't exist. But the positive fact that elephants do exist, we need a, that's, elephants do exist. That's a positive fact. So there must be an explanation for that. So the principle of sufficient reason is just a principle that I think we all share, that says, look, there must be an explanation of the existence of any being or thing and of any positive fact. More in the next video.